A look at the phone in your hand, the car in your driveway, the wind turbine on the hill, the fighter jet defending your country, the hard drive storing your entire life. Every single one of them depends on a group of strange metals you have almost certainly never thought about. Metals with names you cannot pronounce. Neodymium, dysprosium, terbium. One single country controls almost the entire world's supply of them. Not most of it, almost all of it. That country is China. It processes around 90% of them. For some of the most critical ones, it controls up to 99%. And over the past year, quietly and deliberately, China has started to close the tap. This is not a story about a breakthrough China invented. It is a story about a chokehold China already had and just decided to tighten. And by the end of this video, you will understand why this might be the single most powerful economic weapon on the planet. Stay with me, because to understand how one country ended up holding this much power over everyone else, you first have to understand what these metals actually are and why the modern world simply cannot function without them. They are called rare earth elements. There are 17 of them, and the name is one of the most misleading in all of science, because they are not actually rare. Most of them are reasonably common in the Earth's crust. Some are more abundant than copper or lead. So why are they called rare? Because they are almost never found in concentrated deposits. Instead, they are scattered thinly, mixed into other rocks, spread out in tiny amounts across enormous volumes of ore. You do not find a vein of pure neodymium the way you find a vein of gold. You find it smeared in traces through mountains of rock, tangled together with its 16 chemical cousins that all behave almost identically. Finding them is not the hard part. The hard part is separating them out, pulling one element away from another when they are so chemically alike that they resist being told apart. And that difficulty, that stubborn, expensive, poisonous difficulty is the key to this entire story. Because the country that masters the separation does not just get the metals, it gets everyone who needs them. Let me explain why these metals matter so much, because once you understand it, you will see them everywhere. Rare earth elements have unique magnetic and light-emitting properties that almost nothing else in nature can replicate. When you combine certain rare earths like neodymium with iron and boron, you get the most powerful permanent magnets ever created. Magnets so strong and so compact that they made the modern world physically possible. Think about what a tiny, incredibly strong magnet lets you build. It lets you shrink a motor down small enough to fit in a phone that vibrates in your pocket. It lets you build an electric car motor that is light enough, and powerful enough to be practical. It lets a wind turbine generate electricity efficiently. It lets a fighter jet steer its control surfaces, a submarine run silently, a precision missile find its target. Let me make this concrete, because the scale of it is genuinely hard to believe once you start counting. Walk through an ordinary morning. Your phone alarm goes off. The tiny motor that makes it break contains a rare earth magnet. The speaker that plays the sound uses them too. You check the screen, and the vivid red and green colors it produces come from rare earth elements like europium and terbium. You get in your electric car, and its motor may contain a kilogram or more of neodymium magnets. You drive past less than wind farms, and turbines contain hundreds of kilograms of rare earths. At work, the hard drive storing the world's data spin on rare earth magnets. The fiber optic cables carrying the internet are amplified using the element erbium. You cannot get through a single hour of modern life without touching a dozen things that only exist because of these 17 metals. They are woven invisibly into the fabric of everything, and almost none of us have ever heard their names. Without these magnets, electric vehicles as we know them do not exist. Wind power becomes far less efficient, and a huge amount of modern military hardware simply cannot be built. Consider the military side alone, because it is stark. A single F-35 fighter jet contains hundreds of kilograms of rare earth materials. A single Virginia-class submarine contains several tons of them. Guided missiles, radar systems, night vision, targeting systems, drones, all of it depends on these metals. A modern military simply cannot be built without a steady supply. And in 2010, Ethor alone exported around 58 tons of dark matter, enough to build platforms for millions of vehicles upon thousands of minifs and military systems. The entire Western defense industry sits downstream of that single flow of material. Every advanced weapon system the Western world relies on has these metals somewhere inside it, and almost all of those metals pass through China on the way. And here is the number that should genuinely alarm you. China controls over 90% of the world's capacity to process these metals. For the heaviest and most critical rare earths, the ones used in the highest performance magnets, that figure climbs to around 99%. nearly the entire planet's supply of a material that modern civilization depends on, running through one country. So the obvious question is, how did this happen? How did one nation end up with almost total control over something this important? And the answer is not what most people assume. Most people assume China simply got lucky with geology, that it happens to sit on top of most of the world's rare earths. That is not true. China has a lot of rare earths, yes, but so do many other countries. The United States has them. Australia has them. There are significant deposits across Africa and even in Greenland. The raw materials are spread all over the world. China's dominance did not come from having the metals. It came from being willing to do the one thing nobody else wanted to do: process them. Here is the part of the story the West does not like to talk about. Separating rare earth elements from raw ore and from each other is an incredibly dirty, difficult, and toxic industrial process. Again, the reason it is so hard goes back to what we said earlier. These 17 elements are chemically almost identical to one another. They cling together in the same ore, and prying them apart requires dissolving the rock in powerful acids and then passing the solution through hundreds, sometimes thousands of repeated separation stages to isolate each individual metal. It is painstaking industrial chemistry on a massive scale. It produces enormous amounts of hazardous waste, toxic acidic water, chemical solvents, and crucially radioactive material, because rare earth deposits are often naturally laced with radioactive thorium and uranium that comes up out of the ground along with them. Refining these metals at scale creates serious pollution, contaminated land, and serious long-term health risks for the people living near the plants. Decades of this work have left behind lakes of toxic sludge and communities living with the consequences. This was the true price of dominance, and China was the one willing to pay it. For decades, the United States actually led the world in rare earths. A mine in California called Mountain Pass was once the largest producer on Earth. But starting in the 1980s and 1990s, the West's choice, faced with the rising cost of environmental regulation and the availability of cheaper alternative, Western countries were happy to let this dirty work go somewhere else. Again, China stepped forward and volunteered to take it. It built up its processing capacity relentlessly. It accepted the pollution. It absorbed the environmental cost. It invested, for decades, in the industrial know-how of separating these 17 stubborn elements. The West outsourced the dirty problem and told itself it had gotten the better end of the deal. China understood something the West did not. Whoever controls the processing controls the supply. It did not matter who dug the rocks out of the ground. It mattered who could turn those rocks into usable metal. And slowly, patiently, over 30 years, China made sure that the answer to that question was almost always the same: China. And it did not stop at processing the raw metal. It went one step further, and this step is the one that truly locked in its power. China also came to dominate the next stage, turning the processed metals into the finished permanent magnets themselves. Today, China manufactures around 93% of the world's rare earth permanent magnets. So even a country that manages to mine its own ore and even refine some of its own little would still, in cases, had most cases, send it to China to be turned into the actual magnet that goes into the motor. It captured one link in the chain. It captured almost every link that matters. Think of it like a choke point on a global highway. It does not matter how many cars want to travel or where they come from if every single one of them has to pass through one narrow bridge controlled by one country. Control the bridge and you control the traffic. China spent 30 years quietly building itself into that bridge. Deng Xiaoping, the leader who modernized China's economy, is reported to have said as far back as 1992 that the Middle East has oil, but China has rare earths. He understood exactly what the country was building, a strategic resource that the entire world would one day depend on. Again, this is not the first time China has tested this weapon. Back in 2010, during a territorial dispute with Japan, China abruptly halted rare earth exports to the Japanese economy. Japanese industry, heavily dependent on these metals for its onyx and cars, was thrown into crisis almost overnight. The message was received around the world, at least for a moment. Japan faced an alternative source. The rest in alternative sources, and the rest of the world, seeing the crisis pass, largely went back to sleep and kept buying cheap Chinese material. The Vornengoing was fired once, 15 years ago, and then forgotten. That day of reckoning has now arrived again, and this time it is far bigger. Because here is what has happened over the past year, and it is the heart of this story. China has begun to use this control deliberately as a lever of power. In April of 25, China announced sweeping new export controls on 7 rare earth elements and the powerful magnets made from them. Companies around the world that wanted these materials now had to apply for a special license from the Chinese government to get them. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Supply chains that had run smoothly suddenly froze. Factories faced shortages. Prices spiked. Automakers, aerospace companies, and defense contractors around the world were suddenly reminded all at once exactly how dependent they were. And then, later in 2025, China went further. It expanded the controls to cover 12 elements in total. It introduced a rule modeled directly on an American tactic. Just as the United States had restricted any product containing American technology, China declared that any product made anywhere in the world containing even trace amounts of Chinese rare earths, even a tiny fraction of a percent, could now require a Chinese export license. It extended its reach across the entire global supply chain. Most pointedly of all, China spelled out its targets. Applications for overseas military users would be denied. Applications involving the most advanced semiconductors would be reviewed one by one, case by case, giving Chinese authorities the power to approve, delay, or deny at will. Think about what that means. A country on the other side of the world, wanting to build advanced weapons or cutting-edge computer chips, may now need permission from Beijing to obtain a material it cannot get anywhere else in sufficient quantity. That is not just trade policy. That is leverage of a kind that almost no country has ever held over its rivals. Now, I want to be careful and fair here, because this is where it would be easy to slip into fear, and the truth is more balanced than that. China is not doing anything that the West would not do, and in fact has already done. The United States has spent years restricting China's access to advanced semiconductors and chip-making equipment, using its own control over critical technology as a weapon. China's rare earth controls are, in large part, a direct response, a mirror image of the pressure it has been placed under. From Beijing's point of view, it is simply using the one powerful card it holds in a game the other started. Whether you see this as retaliation or as retaliation depends heavily on where you are standing. Again, there is another important truth. This kind of power used too aggressively can burn itself out. The moment China turned rare earths into a weapon, it gave the entire rest of the world a powerful reason to build alternatives. And that is exactly what is now happening. Governments have suddenly woken up, and this time they seem to mean it. The old California mine at Mountain Pass is running again and building its own processing capacity for the first time in decades. Companies are racing to develop rare earth projects in Australia, in Africa, and in Canada, some using new methods to try to make the refining cleaner and faster. The United States has committed large-sum domestic supply chain, with commitments running into the billions to companies willing to mine and process the T's metals at Hiles, are building strategic stockpiles. Engineers are researching new magnet designs that use fewer restricted elements, or ideally none at all. There is real momentum now. The panic of the past year has done what 15 years of quiet warnings could not. It has made the world serious about breaking the dependency. But here is the hard reality that makes this story so serious. None of that happens quickly. Building a rare earth processing industry from scratch takes many years, sometimes a decade or more. You need the mines, yes, but far more importantly, you need the refining plants, the chemical expertise, the environmental permits, the trained workforce, and the willingness to accept the pollution that the West spent 30 years avoiding. Most Western products expected to supply only a fraction of what China provides, and not for years to come. So, for the foreseeable future, the dependency remains. The world has recognized the trap. It has not yet escaped it. Step back and look at the whole picture, because it is a remarkable one. This is not a story of a sudden invention or a lucky discovery. It is a story of patience. While the West chose an easy path, China spent 30 years quietly making itself indispensable. It took a job nobody wanted, mastered it completely, and turned it into one of the most powerful strategic levers on Earth. And it raises a genuinely difficult question about how the modern world works. We spent decades chasing the lowest cost and the cleanest hands, sending our hardest industrial problems somewhere else and feeling good about it. And in doing so, without quite realizing it, we handed a single rival nation a quiet grip on the throat of modern technology. The metals were never really rare. What was rare was the willingness to do the difficult, dirty, patient work of controlling them. China was willing, the rest of the world was not. And now the entire planet is learning what that choice actually cost. It makes you wonder what other dependencies are hiding out there right now, quiet and invisible, waiting for the day someone decides to tighten their grip. If you find these hidden systems of power as fascinating as I do, subscribe because there is far more of this story still to come, and the world is shifting faster than the headlines admit. Again, tell me what you think in the comments. Did the West make a catastrophic mistake by handing this industry to China, or was China simply smart enough to see the value in something everyone else threw away? The most thoughtful answer gets pinned.